Hello, and welcome to episode 426 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Parrott, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. How are you this fine November 14th, Bill?
It's a great day in Florida, Seth. It looks like the hurricane season is past,
Thank God.
just you got to figure out how to get outside and do things.
It's been humid as all get out down here. And just this morning, the cool front came through and starting to feel like seasonal weather as much as you can in the southeastern portion
Yeah,
of the United States.
temperature dropped all the way down to 78 here today. It's perfect. I love it.
Yeah, I'll,
I'm
I'll
not a
take the
cold weather
cold.
person anymore, Seth. I'm sorry.
I love it. We get so little of it. I love every minute that we do get. But anyway, so May 11th, 1945 dawned bright and clear in the waters off Okinawa for the crews aboard the American ships patrolling Radar Picket Station number 15. It had been a restless night and an even more restless morning. Radar had indicated the presence of Japanese snoopers all night long, appearing and then disappearing on American radar like a pack of ghosts. The all-night vigil against presumed enemy aircraft had kept the men up all through the night. All of the ships on station were at GQ, the men receiving little to no sleep whatsoever. For the crew of one of the destroyers, radar picket duty was old hat. They'd been here before. They'd seen the Elephant and survived intact. Their consort, steaming just off their starboard beam, had not. She was new to radar picket duty, but had a veteran crew with many scalps on their belt, having escorted carriers a time or two. But for the crews of both ships, this duty, this day, just felt different. They had all heard the horror stories that had come out of radar picket number 1. They'd seen the mangled wrecks, the shells of former U.S. Navy fighting vessels, similar in appearance and armor to their own ships. They knew what to expect, or at least they thought they knew what to expect. The Japanese had been relatively quiet since their last mass raid a week ago. Kikasui number 5 had wrought havoc on the U.S. Navy on May 3rd and 4th, 1945. 580 American sailors and Marines had been killed on ships on those 2 days alone. Yet since then, the skies had been relatively clear. Maybe the Japanese had shot their bolt. Maybe the skies would remain clear. That previous night, Japanese pilot Isao Matsuo wrote a final letter home to his parents from the Kamikaze base at Miyazaki. Quote, "Please congratulate me. I've been given a splendid opportunity to die. This is my last day. The destiny of our homeland hinges on the decisive battle in the seas to the south, where I shall fall like a blossom from a radiant cherry tree. How I appreciated this chance to die like a man. May my death be as sudden and as clean as the shattering of crystal." Unquote. Petty Officer First Class Isao and 149 others like him would make sure that the skies above Radar Picket Station 15 would not remain clear. The Japanese had most certainly not shot their bolt. The sailors aboard the destroyers USS Hugh Hadley and USS Evans, as well as their supporting ships, would soon find that out the hard way. Bill, we've talked about kamikazes the last several weeks, and we've kind of given a general view of everything. We've gone into, some micro details here and there, but, you know, as we talked about, when you think about the kamikaze raids off of Okinawa, you always think about the carriers. And, there's always that footage of those planes just bam, smacking into the carriers. But as we know, more often than not, a lot of the heavy combat was at the picket stations. And this is certainly one of those stories, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I just want to bounce back to the Petty Officer First Class, his letter back home. This guy is probably, folks, he's probably 20, 21 years old. And
Maybe.
he's been taught to do this, right? And yet he writes poetry where he talks about his death like a blossom falling from not just any cherry tree, but a radiant cherry tree. So he was well educated, well schooled. Maybe he had some help writing this letter, but I doubt it. And this is what a sacrifice, what a sad sacrifice this is of thousands of Japanese and thousands of Americans to prolong a war. Boy, we've talked about this so long. I guess there's no reason to keep talking about it, but it just breaks the heart when you see those words in print, doesn't it, Seth?
It does. It really does because, his life is going to be snuffed out, and we know that he does die,
Mhm.
indeed. His life is going to be snuffed out, and unfortunately, the lives of hundreds of Americans are going to be snuffed out in the process. And for what, to this degree? I mean, we're talking May 1945. The war is, it's not over by any means, obviously, but for Japan, essentially, the war is over. They don't have any kind of hope, and it's heartbreaking, really, for both sides, because the havoc,
Mhm.
as you're going to see in this episode, the havoc that these airplanes wreak is unbelievable. It really is.
That's
It's
right.
unbelievable.
I should have wore my destroyerman hat today, Seth, because today is all about destroyers. So
Mhm.
we talked last week about these picket stations. We said 15 of them numbered from northish of Okinawa, and goes clockwise around to 15. And the one we're talking about today is that last picket station number 15. So of all the different types of assignments, stations, what have you, radar picket duty for an American ship of any type in the water off of Okinawa was the worst. The absolute worst, hands down. More American ships had been hit, some sunk, many severely damaged, with high loss of life while on radar picket duty than anywhere else in the fleet. The destroyers, which mostly manned the picket stations with some small amphibious ships kind of supporting the destroyers, were the sacrificial lambs of the U.S. Navy in April, May of 1945. So when given their assignment 2 days previous, the sailors aboard, 2 days previous, the sailors aboard USS Hugh Hadley, this is DD 774, just groaned. They had pulled picket duty before, although admittedly not at any of the hot spots. Radar picket number 1, the closest to Japan, was known as Death Valley to the tin can sailors, and so far Hadley had not been posted there. Their assignment for this round was station number 15. That sounds like it's a long way away from station number 1, doesn't it, Seth?
It does. When you think about it, it makes sense. It would make perfect sense that it seems like it would be a better spot than Picket 1. But unfortunately, if you look at the map that I'll show here, Picket 15 was directly next to Radar Picket Station number 1, a little bit further south, but still it was in that general vicinity. And it, it's farther from Japan than Radar Picket Station number 1. It's almost 40 nautical miles from Picket 1 and 15 miles from Okinawa. So it's relatively close. And, when you're looking at it on a map in terms of close to shore, and therefore you would think the natural assumption would be that it wouldn't necessarily be that bad. But it also it always depends on where the Japanese are going to go. And as we're going to see in this episode, it's definitely a hot spot. No major attacks thus far had occurred at Radar Picket Station 15. Some kamikaze and conventional attackers had actually made it that far. And 15, as I put in the notes, was no means a walk in the park, but it did not have the outsized reputation of some of the other picket stations, specifically 1 and 2 and 3, but especially Radar Picket Station number 1. So for many of the crew, the orders were groaned at, but as I put in the notes, it could be worse. It could have been a heck of a lot worse. The men aboard the Hadley were riding one of the U.S. Navy's newest and most modern and well-armed destroyers, and we haven't really talked about these guys or this class of ship too much, so it's important that we do go into them now. These are the Allen M. Sumner class of destroyers. The Hugh Hadley was. The USS Evans is a Fletcher. We'll get to her in a minute. But Hugh Hadley is one of the newer class of destroyers that were put out by the U.S. Navy. It was supposed to be an improvement over the Fletcher class. They were armed to the friggin' teeth, Bill. They were sported twin 5-inch 38s and 3 mounts. 12 40 millimeter Bofors and 2 quad mounts and 4 double mounts, as well as 11 or more 20 millimeter Ehrlichens. The Sumners were essentially built for fleet AAA defense. Yes, they could do other destroyers things. They did carry torpedoes and depth charges and that sort of thing. But in reality, They were built to repel Japanese air attacks. They were very fast, capable of achieving over 35 knots. They could turn on a dime because they had a dual rudder system. They were 15 feet longer than a Fletcher, with a 20% increase in armaments, and in terms of 5-inch weaponry, and 50% more AAA. They were absolutely built to kill the Japanese aircraft that they're going to see in spades. But like all destroyers, the Sumner class were not well armored at all. They were not nicknamed tin cans for no reason, Bill. Four of Hadley's class would be lost in the final months of the war. So despite all the guns, they were still vulnerable.
Yeah, they were. Tin cans have that reputation. So also assigned to Station 15 in company with the Hadley was the destroyer USS Evans. That's DD 552. Now, this was not named after the famous Ernest Evans of Leyte Gulf fame. This is named after a Robley D. Evans who served from the Civil War, I think, through the Spanish-American War. So a different Evans. And this is an older destroyer, of course. As you said, it was a Fletcher class, and she had been in the Pacific since early 1944, mainly assigned to anti-submarine duty and carrier escort. The Fighting Bob, Robley Evans, Fighting Bob. I never met a Robley, so I wouldn't know to call him Bob, but I'm going with it, Seth. The Fighting Bob had been around the block, but had not seen heavy combat. Now, in the early part of April, Evans had served offshore, providing call for fire support to the troops fighting on Okinawa. She stayed in that role until May the 2nd, when she put into Karamaretto. Now, we talked about Karamaretto. There was a group of islands west of Okinawa that we built out as a logistics base. It was basically a logistics base of first stop. So anybody that gets hit, that's the first place they go, including the Indianapolis, by the way. It's the first place they go. They get patched up so they can move out of the combat area to some place where they can get some more repairs if necessary before they head on home, or get final repairs if that's possible. So she put into Karamaretto for replenishment and a brief rest. On May the 10th, she, like Hugh Hadley, got underway and proceeded to her assigned stations at Radar Picket number 15. So as Evans took station off Hadley's starboard side, her commanding officer, Commander Robert Archer, Annapolis class of 1928, couldn't help but smile as he looked across at Hugh Hadley, because Hadley was commanded by a good friend and Academy classmate, Commander Baron Joe is short for Baron, guys, Mullaney. The two men had been close at Annapolis and had remained close friends despite being sent in different directions throughout the war thus far. Now, after having not seen one another in many years, here they were quite literally side by side, commanding two different classes of destroyers, but destroyers together, each hoping for the best at the worst possible place to be on Earth at that time in history. And Seth, I got to say to you that I have gone 10, 15, 20 years since seeing one of my Academy classmates. And when you get together again, it's almost like you never separated. It's almost like, the days when you were still midshipmen. It's pretty joyous, but I can imagine these guys weren't very joyous at this moment in history.
Probably not. Probably not. And these two guys had seen a lot of combat action already, both of them, Archer and Mullaney. Archer had actually served aboard USS Essex, if I remember correctly. So he'd been around. Like he wasn't, he wasn't one of these officers that sat in the States. He'd seen a lot of combat action. This was his first destroyer command, was USS Evans. And Mullaney had been a destroyer man pretty much since he got out of the academy. He'd been in DDs dang near his entire career thus far, and he'd seen a lot of action in the Pacific. Once the two destroyers settled in, and it's important to note this too, because these guys are everywhere. Nobody ever mentions them, but we're going to mention them here. It wasn't always just the destroyers. The destroyers, or DEs in some cases, or mine layers or mine sweepers in some places, just depended. They always usually had some sort of assistance with them. And those assistants, if you will, were amphibious vehicles, or amphibious ships of various sizes and classes. And yeah, and this is no different. Once the destroyers got onto position, they were literally side by side. They were surrounded in a ring by LSMR 193, LCS 82, LCS 83, and LCS 84. These are ships, little small ships that are there mainly to provide support to the destroyers. And by that, it's anti-aircraft fire support, it's radar support if they have radar, and they all did. And God forbid if one of these ships, one of the larger ships gets hit, these guys are here to help fight fires, to take wounded off, whatever the case may be. So they are there kind of as a first responder to the destroyers if anything was to happen to them. Altogether now, the 6 ships that are out there at Radar Picket Station 15 was a big unit for a radar picket. Usually it was only 1 destroyer, sometimes 2 in this case, but generally it was, maybe only 3 to 4 ships at a radar picket station. This is twice that number. This is 6. So these guys are going to settle in for the night, and they started immediately receiving hits on their radar. They started tracking bogeys coming in all night long. And the thing with, we talked about this last week and the week before when it came to the kamikaze attacks. It wasn't just, you're not just throwing these human beings at a wall. I mean, to an extent they are, but, the Japanese are searching. They're conducting, thorough searches of the area to find the ripe targets to hit. They're looking for the carriers is what they're doing. And they're also looking for the invasion fleet. And yeah, they know where the invasion fleet is, but they're also trying to find the easiest way to the invasion fleet by skipping around some of these radar pickets. So they're going to be buzzing in and out of radar range all night long. And that's exactly what happens here. On May 11th, Commander Archer looked skyward and smiled faintly as the patrolling combat air patrol of F-4U Corsairs from VF-85, based off of the brand new Essex-class carrier Shangri-La, just kind of patrolled lazily overhead Radar Picket Station 15. They were doing these lazy S-turns, and there were 16 of these F-4Us that were patrolling over. So that's a pretty hefty combat air patrol. However, the problem with this is the Corsairs of VF-85 this day had double and even possibly triple duties. They were not the combat air patrol just for Radar Picket 15. They're going to be combat air patrol for 2 or even 3 other radar pickets. So they're not always going to be directly overhead of the destroyers and the LSMs and the LCSs at Radar Picket 15. So while it's comforting to see those old boys up in the air, they're not always there. That's very important to know. So, Bill, in addition to the F-4Us from Shangri-La, there were some other aircraft available on this very specific day, weren't there?
Yeah, there were, Seth. And by the way, folks will remember Shangri-La. It's a very playful name for an aircraft carrier because when the Doolittle raid was launched against Japan, right? And people asked President Roosevelt where those aircraft launched from. He said Shangri-La, which for you young people was a mythical location. It didn't exist, right? And so now he names an aircraft carrier Shangri-La so he could say it truthfully. The planes launched from Shangri-La. And one more thing I want to do, this is kind of Navy inside baseball, but oftentimes it's the destroyers that are called small boys when they're escorting a carrier. In fact, or battleships. Remember, you may recall from first season or so, small boys light them up. That's an order to the destroyers to engage the enemy. And so here the destroyers are playfully referring to their little amphibious vessels that surround them as their small boys. I think it's fun for the destroyer, crews to think, okay, these guys are even smaller than us. So we're going to refer to them as small boys, just for a little while anyway. You try to have fun wherever you can in situations like this, Seth. So back to the Shangri-La and its 16 F-4U. So 2 more F-4Us from VMF Marine Squadron 323 based at Yontan also provided an overhead umbrella for the craft below. The purpose of these 2 Corsairs was to hug the pickets in case any enemy aircraft slipped through the combat air patrol or happened to sneak past them while they were off patrolling neighboring stations. Their job was to zip out, to a position, hopefully no less than 50 miles from Radar Picket 15, if bogeys were detected by the station's radar. The goal was to intercept before the radars got too close to the ships below. Archer was confident that, along with all of his aerial coverage, his day would be that much easier despite having been kept up all night by those Japanese snooper aircraft. So overboard Hadley, the snoopers gave Commander Mullaney pause as well. With him aboard Hadley was the FDO for the Combat Air Patrol, the flight direction officer, if you remember that, somebody on a ship who's controlling the vector that the airplanes are flying to and providing targeting information for the airplanes, for the Combat Air Patrol. So with them aboard Hadley was the FDO for the CAP and 2 other Corsairs. They had been tracking the snoopers all night long, and the FDO expressed concern that the snoopers may have, in fact, been scouts for a large-scale raid. He's going to be proven to be correct about that. The FDO was right. They were scouts. So what's old Japanese Admiral Ugaki up to right now, Seth?
The poetic tool that we called him last week.
The poetic tool, exactly.
Yeah. So
he's a tool, but he wrote good poetry.
But a poetic tool. He's in charge of all these Kikasui raids. He is the man. He is the man for all these massive, large-scale kamikaze strikes, and this is no different here. He had sent scouts out through the night in an attempt to locate Task Force 58 and hit them. The scouts had been, believe it or not, unable to find Task Force 58, or at least the vast majority of it, and instead had located USS Hugh Hadley, USS Evans, and their friends at Radar Picket 15. Ugaki, who was completely unaware that the ships at Radar Picket 15 were just pickets, he launched his strike that morning bound for what he thought were parts of Task Force 58. And why is that important? Because of the sheer numbers that he's going to send. As the sun rises higher, things begin to pick up in the vicinity of the Radar Picket Station. At 0636, one of the patrolling F-4Us shot down a single Japanese fighter, more than likely another scout. Then at 0740, radar aboard Hugh Hadley picked up a single bogey several miles out, heading towards Radar Picket 15. Commander Mullaney wasted no time and put his ship at GQ. His radar officer, a gentleman named Lieutenant J.G. Doug Aitken, had worked the graveyard shift in the CIC all night long and had been tracking the very same snoopers that we were talking about all through the night. This dude was smoked. He was absolutely exhausted. He'd just been relieved and was finishing his chow when the GQ bell rang. Quote, General Quarters, all hands man your battle stations. Aitken was more than annoyed than concerned when he turned and ran for the CIC yet again. He'd been there all night long as it was. Halfway to the CIC, Hadley's main battery opens fire. Hadley's mate, USS Evans, also opens fire on the inbound aircraft. The aircraft was a float plane and initially headed straight for USS Evans. As Aitken himself recalled, and I quote, the intruder, which called us to General Quarters, was a single aircraft, a Japanese float plane flying very low on the water directly at us, Aitken continued. It had escaped detection by both air and surface search radars and also the Combat Air Patrol of high-flying Marine F-4U Corsairs, which we directed from our ship. Fortunately, we were alert and our gunners shot it down close aboard, unquote. The float plane that he's referring to had evaded the Combat Air Patrol because they were low, and they were so dang low, Bill, the dang surface search radar couldn't even pick this guy up. He was hugging the waves. As he made his way towards Evans, who initially took the float plane under fire, the sheer amount of fire that the Fletcher-class destroyer put up forced this guy to turn around and make his way towards Hugh Hadley, which wound up dropping the bird at a range of 1,200 yards. It's just getting started, though.
It is, yeah. And Seth, I just want to say something about the fatigue these guys are feeling. Now, I suspect most of our listeners have been up for in excess of 24 hours. I don't know what percentage of them found themselves awake for more than 24 hours because they'd been partying. Let me tell you, when you're up for 24, 48 hours because you're working, it's a different kind of exhausted. So these guys, in Lieutenant J.G. Aitken for one, right? These guys are a different kind of exhausted. When I was captain of the submarine, I would try to induce fake stress. It's not really fake stress. I would say artificial stress by running the crew hard for a long, long time, keeping them awake for a long, long time. Boy, oh boy, did the sailors complain, right? Sometimes 24 hours, sometimes longer than that. And I was happy when they were complaining, because when they were complaining, it meant that they were still kind of alert enough to know that their life sucked. When the ones that aren't complaining, the ones that are kind of like losing it, dropping off,
Right.
those are the ones may not be able to handle actual combat conditions. Because again, partying for 20 hours, it's one thing. Working for 24, 36, 48 hours, that's a different kind of fatigue. Working with adrenaline running in your veins like these guys were, that's yet a different kind of fatigue. And when I was skipper, I wanted to know who had it in them, who I could rely on in those situations, and who I would need to worry about in those situations, which is why I ran them in the ground. They would grumble, why are we doing this? It's just training. We are at war. Yeah. Keep complaining, folks. And these guys, right, they didn't need to wonder, because they were operating for real for these long periods of time, right? Aitken reached CIC just after the float plane was shot down, and he immediately tried to figure out what the heck was going on. He asked the radar operator, what the hell's going on? No reason to bounce around the issue, right? How many are there, and where do they come from? The radar operator told them, just one so far. He slipped in under the air search radar, and nobody noticed him on the surface search. Lookouts saw his ass, and we dropped him. Now, with a surface search radar is generally looking for low-speed targets. A fast-moving target on the surface search radar generates what we call high Doppler. But the old radars of that day weren't. The scan rate of the surface search radar isn't fast enough to pick that up. And so you may think that there are different targets, because you're not going to see the blip
if you even pick it up.
If you can even pick it up, if it's below radar, it could be in that gap between the surface skimming surface search radar and the air search radar, right? There's kind of a gap that increases in size with range. So if you can pick it up, but still, even if you do pick it up with the surface search radar, you'll see the blip here, and then you'll see something show up here. And you don't know, are those two different targets that are kind of bobbing in and out like a submarine might do sometime? Or is that the same guy that's going really fast? So it's not an easy problem. You got to keep the lookouts on the alert. They're the only ones who are going to solve this problem. And in this case, they did, Seth.
Indeed, they did. And they were lucky for it, too, for that matter. In the radio room, which is next door to the CIC on board USS Hadley, one of the radio operators was heard to say, and I quote, "Yeah, we got him, but I hear there's more on the way. Lots more," unquote. Lots more, Bill, was an underestimation for sure. The radar operator in the CIC poked Aitken and said, quote, "Look at this," unquote. He pointed to a massive blip on the radar screen that had just broken up into two large blips that were heading straight for Radar Picket 15. Aitken looked at the blip and simply said, "Dear God." Hadley's FDO immediately vectored the combat air patrol out to intercept, but as the blip drew closer, it became apparent that the F4Us, no matter how good they may be, would never shoot down all these bandits that were inbound. Commander Mullaney wrote in his AAR, and I quote, "At about 0755, numerous enemy planes were contacted by our instruments as coming towards the ship and Okinawa from the north, distance about 55 miles. One division of combat air patrol was ordered out to intercept. Shortly thereafter, several enemy formations were detected, and the entire combat air patrol was ordered out to intercept. Our FDO and CIC had estimated the total number of enemy planes as, ready for this, 156, coming in at different heights in groups as follows: Raid 1, 36, Raid 2, 50, Raid 3, 20, Raid 4, 20 to 30, Raid 5, 20. Total 156 aircraft coming for 6 ships, Bill.
Yeah. Altitude separation for traffic control, right? So the airplanes don't fly in each other. They can manage smaller groups at a fixed altitude, but you separate the raids different altitude for deconfliction purposes. So the combat air patrol Corsairs thinned the ranks of the inbound attackers as best they could, but there were simply too many bad guys and not enough good guys. Comms between Hadley's FDO and the combat air patrol were nearly impossible to maintain due to the intensity of the air battle. Guys are too busy fighting to talk, which became the largest dogfight against Kamikaze of the entire Okinawa campaign. CAP estimated that by 0755, they had shot down somewhere between 4 and 50 of the bandits, 40 to 50 of the bandits, but the rest had gotten through their defense, short or out of ammo entirely, and low on fuel. The CAP had to retire as Hadley's FDO urgently requested more aerial assistance from Yontan and the fleet. I would say almost everybody from the CAP ended up retiring, but not all of them, Seth. We'll talk about that later.
Oh, yeah. Yep. As CIC tracked the ongoing aerial melee, it became apparent, very apparent, especially after the CAP pulled out due to lack of ammo and fuel, that there were no friendly aircraft at this point within 10 miles of Radar Picket 15. Seen now by the naked eye of the lookouts on board all the ships, hordes of Japanese aircraft were on the horizon, stacked at varying degrees of altitude, just like you were saying, Bill. As the first gaggle of aircraft came within range, all ships in the group opened fire. The first group of Japanese aircraft ignored the ships below and flew onwards, obviously looking for bigger game, more than likely the invasion fleet that's just offshore of Okinawa, packed with men and supplies. As the first group came in range, both Hadley and USS Evans opened fire. Hadley was credited with shooting down 4 of the aircraft as they overflew the picket station. These are the guys that decided to look for bigger game. As the first group, now some 40 to 50 aircraft overflew the ships, another group appeared on the horizon, and then another, and then another. To the north of the picket station, the skies were, quote, black with Japanese aircraft, unquote. Aboard USS Evans, Commander Archer said to no one in particular, quote, "My God, look at all those damn things," unquote. Bill, that had to be a pucker moment of biblical proportions, because here you are in 2 destroyers. Admittedly, they're both heavily armed and they both, can more than handle themselves. But it's just you 2 and your smaller, amphibious ships around you. You're not tied up next to the New Jersey here. It's just you guys, and here come, a flock of bad guys, and they're coming right for you, Jack. There is no mistaking this. They're coming right for you.
Yeah, Seth, I would never compare my experience on 9/11 with what these guys were going through. But when he saw those airplanes coming in at him, he must have had this very same thought I had when I heard the airplane come in towards the Pentagon. The only thought I remember going through my head was, am I going to survive this? And I suspect he was wondering the same thing with all those airplanes coming at him. As the group approached the picket station, it became clear that this group was not going to overfly like the first flight did. They're coming for them, and they were gaining fast. As they came within range of Evans' main battery, 5 inches, she opened fire. Hadley opened fire at almost the same time. The attacking aircraft were of almost every type in the Japanese inventory: Zeros, Vals, Kates, Bettys, biplanes. Biplanes, remember, are often from, catapults off of cruisers and battleships and stuff like that. They need the extra lift of the two wings because they need to gain flight at a relatively low airspeed. But in this case, they're using everything. All the stops are pulled out. Seaman First Class J. Holmes, at the Fire Control Director of Hadley next to Commander Mullaney, said, "Some were sneaking in just off the water, and others began diving at us from all directions. It was chaos." Mullaney's after-action report states, quote, "From this time on, the Hadley and the Evans were attacked continuously by numerous enemy aircraft coming in at us in groups of 4 to 6 planes on each ship at one time." So they've got 4 to 6 planes making simultaneous attacks on each ship at the same time, trying to basically overwhelm the ship's anti-air defenses, Seth.
Exactly. And there were tactics by this stage. This is, early to middle part of May of 1945. We've been doing this for, over a month now at these radar pickets defending ourselves against kamikazes. So there had been tactics that we had, I don't want to say developed, but to a point, yeah, we had, especially the DDs, is that, they're faster, maneuverable. So when these airplanes are coming in range, the destroyers are cranking it up. They're they're giving it the spurs, wide open throttles. They're twisting and turning, they're moving every which way they can, but they're also trying to, you would think that they would want to present their bow or their stern to the attacking enemy to provide the narrowest target, the smallest target. But what the destroyers are going to do in almost every case is they're going to actually turn broadside to these things. And it makes sense too, when you think about it, because they're going to bring every single gun barrel they have on that ship that they can to bear on these attacking enemy planes. And that is exactly what's going to be done here. As they're coming in, Commander Mullaney and Commander Archer started doing that very thing, Bill. They started maneuvering their ships so as to bring their full main battery to bear on the closest wave of enemy aircraft, heeling their ships over in violent maneuvers so as to unmask their broadside. The two destroyers, unfortunately, in the heat of the moment, became separated. And of course, this is going to be a problem because they can't mutually defend themselves in a close range attack. And they were separated at one point by as many as 2 to 3 miles. Consistent calls from Mullaney to Archer, because Mullaney's ship Hadley had the FDO. He was the tactical officer in command at that point. For Evans to close in were all negated due to enemy attacks and the ships having to maneuver. So it wasn't that Archer didn't want to bring his ship close. Quite the opposite. He did. But every single time he tried to get closer to Hadley, or Hadley tried to get closer to Evans, attacks forced the ships to maneuver in such a way that they could not get together to have that mutual defensive firepower. We don't know if that was an actual Japanese plan or if it just worked out that way. We have no idea. But at least 5 times, Commander Archer attempted to bring Evans close in, but attacks prevented him from doing so. Mullaney was able to close in on the small boys, and together all guns between Hadley and the small boys were brought to bear on the attackers. While this occurred, as I said, Evans became separated, and she essentially was on her own. For the next 45 minutes, gun crews aboard USS Evans were in constant action. Japanese aircraft came pouring in on Evans as she sailed wildly in the sea, throwing enormous volumes of AAA at her attackers. Evans was repeatedly attacked by groups, like Bill was saying, of 4 to 6 aircraft each time. Her gunners kept up a massive barrage of AAA that rapidly downed 6 Japanese aircraft in a span of 8 minutes. Over the next 20 minutes, her gun crews downed another 7 aircraft and were credited with an assist on 4 more. So as we know, we've talked about this before, Bill, these Fletcher-class destroyers, they can throw up a wall of anti-aircraft fire, and this is no different here. And Hadley is no slouch either. So, Bill, tell us about what happens around 0830.
Well, Seth, 3 Kate torpedo bombers were sighted boring in from the port quarter, and Evans shot down all 3 of them. Over the next 15 minutes, Evans gunners downed a mix of 7 aircraft identified as Kates, Jills, and Zeros, and Tonys. One of the Kates got close enough to drop a torpedo before it went down. Commander Archer ordered a hard left rudder, and the torpedo missed ahead of the bow by only 25 yards, way too close. But now he's maneuvering in reaction to the enemy. The enemy's coming in at random vectors, and so he's having to maneuver to random courses. Following the torpedo attack, an Army Tony aircraft was shot down by both Evans and Hugh W. Hadley, crashing 3,500 yards from the former. Then a Naval dive bomber on a suicide dive. So this was a fairly skilled kamikaze pilot, was hit, and the pilot lost control, missing Evans and crashing 2,000 yards beyond. An Army KI-43, like you said, Seth, they're bringing the kitchen sink here.
Yeah, they are.
It dropped a bomb that missed and was shot down while attempting to crash into Evans. Another Army Oscar and a Navy Jill torpedo bomber made a run in from the port side, and both were shot down close aboard. A few minutes later, Evans shot down a Tony fighter on an attack run. Seth, it's tiring just naming all these planes that are coming at these guys.
You know what it reminds me of, honestly? When I was going through all this stuff, it reminds me of, and we've said this before, it reminds me of walking outside in South Louisiana in August and just getting hit by
mosquitoes.
A horde of, yeah. And you stand there for a while and you look like you're having a fit because you're swatting these damn things out of your face. It looks like you're having some kind of an episode. It's not much different here, except for these things are trying to kill you. They're not trying to suck your blood. They're trying to draw your blood. Yeah, these are big mosquitoes. These are big mosquitoes. So as much fire as Evans is putting up, and she is putting up a tremendous amount, and she is giving a hell of an account of herself at 0907. Unfortunately, Bill, her luck runs out. A Judy dive bomber came in from directly ahead, low on the water. Evans's forward main battery engaged the enemy aircraft and hit it, but it just kept on coming. In seconds, the Judy was on the ship, crashing into her bow just above the waterline, holding her up forward and allowing tons of seawater to enter her forward crew berthing station. Yet, and this goes to the stability and just sheer toughness of a Fletcher-class destroyer, despite that damage, she never lost way and kept up her rate of fire. Lieutenant James Smith, the ship's doctor aboard USS Evans, later recalled that there was a, quote, whirlwind of planes coming at us from every direction. Guns were firing so rapidly that reliefs had to be afforded to the exhausted loaders, just the loaders. The ship was surrounded with smoke from our own fire, and it was difficult to spot the Japanese because of the black shell bursts that mingled with them, unquote. That's when you know you're throwing up a lot of fire. If you can't see past your own powder fire, you know you're throwing up a lot of lead. The sheer amount of AAA thrown up by the American ships clouded the sky and made it physically difficult to see. Radar targets were quite literally everywhere, and to be honest, the radar didn't help as the aircraft were so close and their numbers were so great. Because of the lack of visibility, another Japanese aircraft, this time a fighter, we don't know what kind, doesn't matter, hit Evans again at 0911. So that's going to be what, Bill? What did I say? 4 minutes after the first one. This airplane crashed portside midships just below the waterline. The hole in Evans's hull flooded her after engine room, causing the destroyer to slow down. And Bill, as we all know, once a ship begins, especially in an air attack, begins to slow down, bad things usually happen, don't they?
She becomes even more vulnerable. That's exactly right. Of course, hitting in the engine room, you worry about the boilers exploding. So there was a lot going on with the damage control parties at this point. So as Evans slowed, more Japanese aircraft came in. Commander Archer later said, we could see our 20 millimeters hitting him. Pieces of his airplane were flying off in all kinds of directions, but he kept coming. They all did. They just kept coming. 2 Oscar fighters smacked Evans in quick succession. Boom, boom. The first one released a bomb before it crashed into the ship. The bomb plowed through the ship's hull and exploded deep inside the vessel. You remember the Kamikaze with the Indianapolis in Okinawa goes through the hull and explodes underneath. These kind of things happen, folks. Evans forward fire room and both forward boilers were destroyed by the bomb, and the airplane itself crashed and sprayed flaming avgas all over the deck. Within seconds, a second Oscar hit the starboard side of the ship, causing more damage and more fires. By 0925, Evans was dead in the water and afire. She slowed to a stop. Another kamikaze zoomed overhead with a Corsair in hot pursuit. Another Corsair miraculously appeared to chase off and down two more suicide aircraft bound for Evans. The Japanese, assuming Evans to be sinking, and she was, turned their attention to Hadley, who now took the brunt of the assault alone. Seth, so this is the pinnacle, or is it going to get worse here?
It gets worse. It doesn't get any better. It doesn't get any better for any time in the near future. So, quote, "We didn't have time to count, but I guess other people did. The records say we had at least 10 of them coming at us in waves at a time. At 0920, the Japanese focused their attention on Hadley. The attack was such that Commander Mullaney could no longer bring all of his guns on one side to bear, as they were all firing at the same time at targets coming in from literally every position on the friggin' clock. From then on, Mullaney steered his ship in an effort to avoid the suicide aircraft as they came in one after the other. So no longer, Bill, is he maneuvering his vessel to bring all of his weapons to bear, because there's so many planes coming in. All he's trying to do is skid his ship out of the way. And I mean, it's a destroyer. It's not a huge ship, but it's not small either. And I mean, to be able to skid a ship out of the way of an oncoming aircraft takes some serious skill as a skipper. I mean, that's significant. This is not, some easy feat by any means, is it?
No, do some of that ship driving stuff is,
Man,
to steal from Top Gun, right? And these guys were great ship handlers. Yeah, that's a real
had to be
art,
Yeah.
folks.
Yeah,
And submarines as well as surface ships and destroyers in particular, those destroyer skippers really prided themselves on their ship handling. So then a fight that lasted minutes, 10 enemy planes which had surrounded Hadley, 4 on the starboard bow, came under fire by the main battery machine guns. 4 on the port bow were under fire by the forward machine guns, and 2 astern were under fire by the aft machine guns, and they all attacked the ship simultaneously. All 10 aircraft were shot down by the Hadley alone. On one airplane came at the ship and passed through Hadley's rigging, carrying away wires, antennas, crashing close aboard her port side. One of Hadley's gun captains peeped his head out of the forward 5-inch mount and yelled in an exasperated tone, "Christ almighty, that was close." The next one was even closer. These guys had to think that they really needed to duck. Accounts vary for the obvious reasons, but through this fusillade, Hadley was hit 4 times in quick succession. At least 3 kamikazes hit her, and at least one 550-pound bomb, 250 kilogram. The initial after-action report stated that Hadley was hit by an Oka, but USN damage reports negate that, saying that bomb fragments were found aboard and there was no evidence of an Oka. So that you could tell the damage because it's a very, very different type of bomb. Nevertheless, Hadley took a beating and took a beating fast. The first kamikaze would hit came in from astern, dropped a bomb that hit the after port side quad 40 mount. These are the Bofors, and then proceeded to crash into the aft superstructure just aft of the number 2 funnel. The resulting explosion and fire caused a massive conflagration aboard the ship and wiped out our 20 and 40 millimeter gun crews on that side of the ship. Seth, there was something with this seaman first class Frank Gephardt. What was that going on?
Yeah, he's on the starboard side of Hadley on one of the 40 millimeter mounts. He later said, and I quote, "I thought that sucker had my name on it," unquote. As it was, the resulting explosion threw Gebhardt against the torpedo tubes. And aside from knocking the wind out of him, he was essentially unharmed. With his mount now destroyed and fire creeping in on him, Gebhardt yelled for his gun crew to, quote, get the hell out of there, unquote. Most of his crew jumped overboard to escape the fire, but 2 men were swept up in the blaze and killed. Gebhardt himself bailed. He jumped overboard and bobbed in the water and watched an F-4U clearly out of ammunition climb on top of a Japanese aircraft and ride him into the water. Yes, that is 100% true. That was witnessed by almost every vessel in the formation. An F-4U got on top of this damn thing and pushed his ass into the water and lived to tell the tale, by the way. And no, I don't know the pilot.
Seth?
I'm pretty sure, yeah, because I'm pretty sure it was, because at this point, and you got to remember, this stuff is happening. I mean, boom, boom, boom. It's happening faster than we're talking here. And the Combat Air Patrol from Shangri-La, by now, they're probably trapped aboard the ship. And they're not coming back out, or another group is not coming back out right now. And even if they are, they're not going to get here that damn fast. So these have got to be Marines based off of Yantan. Now, who that pilot was, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. And if somebody does, please let us know. I was unable to find the gentleman's name. But honest to God, that happened. And I want to go back to something you said a minute ago when the Kamikaze went through the ship's rigging. And one of the guys popped his head out of the 5-inch mount and just said, Christ almighty, that was close. You've said this before, and we've talked about this a million times. There's those moments of gallows humor. When you are in the middle of being attacked by a swarm of enemy aircraft, and by the way, you shoot down all 10, which is incredible. And that's a Navy fact. That is an absolute fact. Hadley shot down all 10 of those aircraft that came at her. And you got a guy that pops his head out of a turret and says, man, that was close. It's like, well, no kidding. No kidding. But it's that typical gallows. Yeah, but it's that typical gallows humor that breaks that tension, if not for just a second, that, helps these people get through some of these kind of situations. So what many scholars assume to be the last hit on Hugh Hadley was, as I put in the notes, a double whammy, a bomb and a kamikaze. The airplane hit the starboard side of the ship at the waterline right next to the after fire room. Bad place to hit it. The bomb the airplane was carrying went clean through the ship and exploded underneath her. The bomb exploded right under her keel, causing, quote, severe flexural vibrations running through the ship for 20 seconds, unquote. So in other words, it fractured the ship's keel for all intents and purposes. And Bill, when that happens, that's not a good situation, is it?
No, because, the skin of the ship is not meant to support the kind of loads, the cyclical loads that the ocean will generate as the ship goes through, the waves. So it begins to come apart once the keel has been cracked. And, we're not going to do a spoiler alert here. We're not going to tell you whether that happens yet. But inside Hadley's CIC, Doug Aitken, this is a lieutenant junior grade, had been shaken by the sharp detonations aboard the ship, knocked off his feet at least twice. He was a bit dazed. He knew his ship was hurt, but how bad he did not know. He popped outside and looked aft. The fantail was awash. That's bad news. Our list to starboard was several degrees and worsening. That's bad news. What we didn't know then was that the bomb that exploded underneath left us with a 56-inch hump in our keel. That's bad news. By any measure, we should have been sunk right there, but we didn't, unquote. As fast as the attack had started, it ended. The skies were empty except for a handful of F-4Us in the distance. An eerie quiet hung over the sea as Hadley's crew tried to save their ship. Looking across the water, about 2 miles away now, Evans sat motionless and on fire. Aboard Hadley, Commander Mullaney stood on the bridge and collected his thoughts. His ship was sinking in a fire. His guns were silent and inoperable, and he could see scores of wounded crew. How many of his crew were dead, he did not know. But what he did know was he wasn't going to leave his ship. So his XO shows up to the rescue, right, Seth?
Yeah, not so much. And it's again, it's one of these humorous moments. It wasn't humorous at the time, but it's humorous now.
No.
So his executive officer runs up to him. Clearly, like this guy, clearly, God bless his heart, didn't like he knew what was going on, but he's kind of out of it at the moment. He yells, "Quote, Captain, we've been hit," unquote. Mullaney, his patience clearly had was gone. He lost his cool, turned on his heels, and yelled at the XO, quote, "Holy Christ, man, you think I don't know that?" Unquote. Now get your ass below and see what you can do to get the wounded off. Move. Mullaney's outburst, and that's exactly what it was, seemed to snap everyone on the bridge back to reality. Men at that point began to start moving. Many moved out of the bridge and went to help fight fires and get the wounded to the side. Mullaney turned to his navigator and asked, quote, "Do we have propulsion? Can we move at all?" Unquote. The answer was, of course, negative. He then told a sailor, "Get every flag we have and raise it. If we're going to sink, we'll go down with all flags flying." God bless his heart. Hadley's after engineering spaces were flooded and the ship immediately lost headway, slowing almost to a stop and started taking a 5-degree list, and she began to settle by the stern. From Commander Mullaney's AAR, the situation was dire, and I quote, "The ship was badly holed, and immediately both engine rooms and one fire room were flooded, and the ship settled down and listed rapidly. All 5-inch guns were out of action. Our fire was raging aft of number 2 stack. Ammunition was exploding, and the entire ship was engulfed in a thick black smoke, which forced the crew to seek safety, some by jumping over the side, others by crowding forward and awaiting orders. The ship was helpless to defend herself, and at this time, the situation appeared hopeless." That's never something that a commanding officer wants to ever say about his ship, Bill.
Now, 2 observations here, Seth, at this point. The first thing, Ecclesiastes, there's a time for everything. It doesn't say there's a time for anger, but there is. And the skipper's anger here to the XO was exactly what was needed to get people moving again. So that's absolutely right. And the second observation is, it's miraculous that the Japanese kamikaze attack, the skies cleared right at the moment that these folks, none of their 5-inch guns were operating anymore. If there'd been one more wave, it would have been all over for both of these ships. And you can't explain why it is that this went down the way it is, but I'm sure he saw divine intervention here. The commanding officer received reports from the chief engineer and the damage control officer which indicated that the main spaces were flooded and the ship was rapidly developing into a condition which would capsize her. The exploding ammunition and the raging fire appeared to be extremely dangerous. The engineers were securing the forward boilers to prevent them from blowing up. The order to prepare to abandon ship was given, and life rafts and floats were put over the side. A party of about 50 men and officers were being organized to make a last fight to save the ship and the remainder of the crew, and the wounded were put over into the water, unquote. So this is from his written report. So since this written report survived, you can probably predict that he's survived, okay?
Indeed.
But this isn't over for them, is it, Seth?
No, not at all. Mullaney ordered everyone off of Hadley, with the exception of 50 men, all of whom were volunteers to stay. These 50 guys immediately began efforts to keep the ship from blowing apart. Fires are raging pretty much everywhere topside, and they're creeping closer to Hadley's torpedoes, which are obviously going to be a big kaboom if they go off. So the salvage crew, such as they were, 50 of them, started just pumping these torpedoes out, jettisoning the torpedoes as fast as they could. Mullaney then ordered that all remaining ammunition be thrown overboard. Doesn't matter. Your guns can't shoot. You might as well get rid of the ammo. That's exactly what they do. Throughout her ordeal, listen to this, and this comes straight out of her after-action report. Hadley had fired 801 rounds of 5-inch, 8,950 rounds of 40 millimeter, 5,990 rounds of 20 millimeter ammunition. That is pretty much emptying her magazine. In an effort to reduce weight on the listing starboard side, everything that wasn't nailed down, and I do mean that very seriously, was thrown overboard. If it was secured, it was cut or broken down and tossed overboard. So they're throwing anything they can off that starboard side to lighten that side of the vessel. As crewmen went below to secure the boilers, in an effort to keep them from exploding, the small boys, the amphibious ships that had been at Radar Picket 15, came alongside and lashed themselves to Hadley to keep her afloat.
That's amazing.
They didn't send, I mean, they did send firefighters over to help with the fires, but they literally tied themselves to the side of the damn destroyer to help keep her afloat. That is freaking cool.
All the buoyancy you can get, right?
Absolutely.
Their extra buoyancy. Yeah. And it worked. My goodness.
Yeah,
it worked.
Yes,
I don't know. I'm not the historian here, but I don't know of any other situation where LCM or whatever they were tied itself to a destroyer to correct buoyancy for a listing ship, right? My goodness. If you can't run the pumps, you don't want to counterflood because you're already too deep in the water, whatever, you can't pump the water on the side that's lowest overboard. This is like plan D, folks, for keeping the ship from sinking. So as crewmen so Evans was still dead in the water, but her list had been controlled and her fires put out. The fleet tug USS Cree had made her way up to RP-15 and had taken Evans in tow by the stern, headed for Coramaretto. As Evans began to clear the area, Mullaney scribbled a note to be sent to his old friend Commander Robert Archer aboard Evans via signal light, flashing light. It read, "Captain Bob, believe I can save my ship. I am proud to have fought this battle with you. Sincerely, Joe." What a wonderful note. To send that, to say, it's almost, this is almost Horatio Nelson-like, right? I am proud to have fought this battle with you, sincerely, Joe. And he really didn't know whether he would survive to see the next day, or his ship would sink, or what would happen to him, right? He did not know. And so he's thinking, this is the last message I'm going to get off to an old classmate and friend. It's wonderful. So as efforts was still underway to keep Hadley afloat, Mullaney's XO came to him and brought good news. With the fact that the LSMs and LCSs had lashed themselves to the ship, most of the flooding had been stopped. Mullaney looked at his XO, who was covered in a mixture of oil, grease, and blood. Now there's a guy who's been in combat. And he asked him, "Do you think we can save her?" The XO replied, "Hell yes, we can." There's a good XO. Attaboy XO.
It's the same XO who came up and said, "Captain, I think we've been hit." But,
Yeah.
but again, some snap to. And when he does, the man goes down there and performs a hell of a job. Hadley's radar officer, the guy that we talked about before, Lieutenant Junior Grade Douglas Aitken, he was one of the guys that stayed aboard, one of the 50 volunteers that stayed aboard Hadley. He stayed aboard to man the CIC, which was, as I put in the note, miracle of miracles, still working despite the beating that this ship had taken. Most of her electronics were still working. Ordered to get rid of any and all top secret documents, just in case, Aitkins grabbed a weighted bag and threw the documents overboard. As he stood near the side and watched the bag sink, his mind went back to his Boy Scout days. Aitken, an Eagle Scout, remembered the scouting motto, "Be prepared." He laughed when he thought of that and said out loud, quote, "Who the hell could have prepared for something like this?" Unquote. I mean, nobody can prepare for that. The fast transport USS Barber, auxiliary fleet tug ATR-114, and destroyer USS Wadsworth came up to render assistance to Hugh Hadley. The Wadsworth's lookouts searched the sky for any renewed Japanese threat, of which there were none, thank God, while LCS 82 and LCS 84 had their hands full with the heavily damaged USS Evans. LSM 193 and LCS 83 began towing Hadley about noon to the nearest relative safety, the temporary anchorage at Ieshima, which was actually closer than Karamoreto, a small island just northwest of Okinawa. She indeed would be saved, Bill.
Wow. That's incredible, Seth. It really is.
It really is.
Hadley, battered and broken but not dead, was towed to Karamoreto and entered floating dry dock ARD 28 for temporary repairs. Once you get in that dry dock, it's like a warm hug from your mom. You know you're going to be okay. Sailors from the repair ship USS Zanaya went to work. In July, steel I-beams were welded to the interior of the hull to hold the shattered destroyer together. Remember the keel. Mm-hmm. And the exterior of the hull was patched with steel plating. From there, the Hadley was towed to Buckner Bay, the main Okinawa anchorage. There she was provisioned and taken in tow by the tug ATA 199. With a reduced crew, the ship was towed 7,000 miles at an average speed of 7 knots. There's a lot of sevens in there. You can figure out how many hours it took to go those 7,000 miles at 7 knots, with a couple of stops in between at Saipan and Wetak, Pearl Harbor, before the 2-month odyssey ended on September 26th, 1945. So the 2-month odyssey ended after the war was over, where she tied up at Hunters Point Naval Air Shipyard, Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, which is where, by the way, the Indianapolis loaded the atomic bomb before it got away for Saipan last July. Along the way, the Hadley skirted a typhoon, and the tow line parted 9 times. That is not surprising, folks.
Mm-hmm. Not for 7,000
She would
miles.
never again, exactly. She would never again sail under her own power. What's the point of patching her up? The war is over, Seth.
Yeah, she will never see the sea again. The fight at Radar Picket Station 15 was the single heaviest kamikaze assault on any one task group during the entirety of the war. Kikasui number 6, which is what this was a part of, had been a bad one for the pickets at Radar Picket Station 15, but they had survived. And miraculously, Bill, none of the ships at Radar Picket 15 sunk. Hadley and Evans, as well as the small boys, set a record at Radar Picket 15 in terms of kills. Hadley shot down a record 23 confirmed aircraft. Evans shot down 15 confirmed, but the 2 DDs didn't do all of the work by themselves. LCS 82 shot down 3 aircraft and assisted in downing 2 more. At 0845, LCS 82 assisted LCS 84 in shooting down a Tony on the port side. Then an Oscar came in from the starboard bow, and gunners on LCS 82 hit it repeatedly. As the plane passed overhead at 1,000 feet, it broke apart and debris fell towards LCS 82. The skipper, Lieutenant Peter Barrell, adroitly maneuvered the vessel so that the wings and engine fell in his wake. At 0940, a Val being pursued by Combat Air Patrol passed astern, and LCS 82 gunners hit it as well, causing it to narrowly miss USS Evans. LCS 83 shot down 3 Zeros and a Tojo between 09 and 0939. LCS 84 saw a Zeke diving on LCS 83 and shot it down. So these little ships, as we've said before, they're not, the South Dakota in terms of AAA, but they have enough weaponry on them to do some significant damage, and they do. And they're not the only ones. Tell us about LSM 93, Bill, or 193. I'm sorry.
And by the way, one thing about these LSMs I love is that they're commanded by lieutenants. We need more of those kinds of ships in today's Navy. So despite LSMR 193's less than optimum anti-aircraft capability, she also gave a good account of herself. At 0845, a Kate torpedo bomber dove on Evans, but missed and aimed for LSM R-193 instead, but was shot down by 5-inch and 40-millimeter gunfire. At 0859, LSM R-193 shot down another Kate, and then at 0912 shot down a HAMP. The LSM shot down a fourth plane. She's almost an ace, Seth. And then assisted in shooting down yet another that was headed for Hugh Hadley. LSM R-193 subsequently went alongside her to assist in fighting the fire and tend to wounded. LCS-182 and LCS-82 and LCS-84 were alongside, assisting the crippled Evans, while LSM-193 and LCS-83 were alongside equally wounded Hugh Hadley. The combined efforts brought the fires and flooding on both destroyers under control. All these ships are commanded by lieutenants, and they did a wonderful job in mitigating the extent of damage on these two badly wounded destroyers, Seth.
I think you could legitimately make the statement that if the LCS, and God, there's alphabet soup today, Bill.
It is,
It really is. If the LCS and the LSM do not lash themselves to Hadley, she goes down. I think that's a very legitimate statement, because until they did that, she was sinking. Her list was increasing. The flooding had not been stopped. And because they were able to lash themselves to the ship and keep her afloat, the DC parties were able to get in there and plug the holes for all intents and purposes. That's what they're doing. They're sticking mattresses and whatever the hell they can find in the holes in the hull to keep the water out as best they can.
Seth, I can't believe it's taken me this long and how many 160 episodes to say this, but thank God for those bosun's mates.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very true. Very true. Very true. And the boats, as they call them, those are the unsung heroes of the U.S. Navy. But the small craft, and again, I sound like I'm a broken record, but again, when you think of the kamikazes, you think of the fleet, you think of the big ships, and these little vessels, of which there's still one at Mare Island and just outside of San Francisco, that you can tour, by the way. They played a vital role at these radar picket stations. And when we talk about our next week's topic, which, of spoiler alert, is going to be USS Laffey, you're going to understand why even more of these little LCS and LSMs were vital to those radar picket stations everywhere they were. So 30 men were killed and a further 29 were wounded aboard USS Evans. Casualties aboard Hadley were, no surprise here, heavier because she took more hits. 30 men were killed and 67 were wounded aboard USS Hadley. Both Hadley and Evans were awarded, and rightfully so, the Presidential Unit Citation, and the Naval Unit Commendation was awarded to all of the amphibious vessels at Radar Picket 15. Hadley's crew were awarded 8 Silver Stars and 8 Bronze Stars. Evans's crew received similar awards. Both commanders, Mullaney of Hadley and Archer of Evans, both received the Navy Cross, as did Hadley's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Patrick McGann. And if anybody deserved a Navy Cross aboard Hadley, it was her gunnery officer. His citation reads, and I quote, "Fighting valiantly against waves of hostile suicide and dive-bombing planes plunging toward her in all directions, the USS Hugh Hadley sent up relentless barrages of anti-aircraft fire during one of the most furious air-sea battles of the war. Repeatedly finding her targets, she destroyed 23 planes, skillfully directed the combat air patrol in shooting down at least 40 others, and by her vigilance and superb battle readiness avoided damage herself until subjected to a coordinated attack by 10 Japanese planes," unquote. Yeah, I'd say, Bill, that he definitely deserved his Navy Cross. His citation. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I may do something very weird here, Seth, and get up and show you what the Navy unit commendation looks like, because my submarine earned one too. So you keep talking.
Do it, and I'll finish the citation here. So, and it goes like this, and I quote, "Assisting in the destruction of all 10 of these, she was crashed by one bomb and 3 suicide planes with devastating effect. With all engineering spaces flooded and with a fire raging amidships, the gallant officers and men of the USS Hugh W. Hadley fought desperately against insurmountable odds, and by their indomitable determination, fortitude, and skill brought the damage under control, enabling their ship to be towed to port and saved. Her brilliant performance in the action reflects the highest credit upon the Hugh Hadley and the United States Naval Service, unquote.
And let's see if I could do this. It's opposite. So the Navy unit commendation is right there, Seth. That's what they look like. That's the one my submarine earned. That's my Commodore flag. Right there. I can learn how to operate backwards. But that is the Navy unit commendation. And,
That's outstanding.
Yeah, and that's what every one of those, the small guys earned that. The amphibs, the destroyers earned a presidential, which I have not earned or been awarded. But USS Washington submarine, nuclear submarine, just a month or so ago was awarded a presidential. And I look shorter than I normally look right now, but I'm not going to move the camera back since we're almost at the end of this episode.
We are. So we talked about the combat air patrol pilots, of which most of them were Marines, not all of them, but most of these guys are Gyrenes. Mullaney later wrote of the pilots who were his combat air patrol, quote, "It can be recorded that the aviators who comprised the combat air patrol assigned to the Hadley gave battle to the enemy that rank with the highest traditions of our Navy's history. When the leader was asked to close and assist us, he replied, 'I am out of ammunition, but I am sticking with you.' He then proceeded to fly his plane at enemy planes attacking in an attempt to head them off. Toward the end of the battle, I witnessed one Marine pilot attempting to ride off a suicide plane." That's the one we were talking about. "The plane hit us, but not vitally. I am willing to take my ship to the shores of Japan if I can have these Marines with me," unquote. Semper Fi. My God.
Semper Fi.
Bill, summarize this fight in the words of Commander Mullaney for us, will you?
Yeah, so no words are better than those of that guy you just named, Commander Mullaney, who said, quote, "No captain of a man of war ever had a crew who fought more valiantly against overwhelming odds. Who can measure the degree of courage of men who stand up to their guns in the face of diving planes that destroy them? Who can measure the loyalty of a crew who risked death to save the ship from sinking when all seemed lost? I desire to record that the history of our Navy was enhanced on 11 May 1945. I am proud to record that I know no record of a destroyer's crew fighting for 1 hour and 35 minutes against overwhelming enemy aircraft attacks and destroying 23 planes. My crew accomplished their mission and displayed outstanding fighting abilities. I'm recommending awards for the few men who displayed outstanding bravery above the deeds of their shipmates in separate correspondence. Destroyer men are good men, and my officers and crew were good destroyer men," unquote.
I don't know of any other way we could end this episode, Bill, but with those words. I think if we tried to say anything else, it would be foolish.
I agree with you, Seth. I do want to make just one kind of observation, pulling the conversation into the modern era. Here you had 150-ish kamikaze airplanes. What is it?
156.
156 kamikaze airplanes flying at these two destroyers and a collection of smaller ships outfitted for anti-aircraft. And of course, these kamikaze pilots were willing to go to their deaths. In modern warfare, this would still happen, but it would be cruise missiles, unmanned cruise missiles, and drones being flung at our ships, not kamikazes per se. I don't have a lot of confidence that the outcome would be much different. And by that, what I mean is there would be substantial damage to the fleet. This is a fight that we continue to need to learn from. And I worry that we're not learning the right lessons, Seth.
Let's hope we never find out.
I agree.
Or rather, let's hope we never find out the hard way, I should say. I think that's
Yep.
probably a better way to say it. So
Yeah, and so somebody's could comment that that's what's happening in the Red Sea with the Houthis and all of that on a tiny, tiny scale. I agree, but not the saturation type of attack that these guys saw in 1945, or that we would see in a peer-to-peer fight.
156 enemy aircraft is a big ass flight of planes, no matter what time of the war you're talking about. I don't care if you're talking about 1941 or 1945. That's a lot of planes. And when they're coming at 6 ships, and yes, some of them broke off and attacked other things, and a lot of them were shot down by combat air patrol, but regardless, 156 airplanes. That's a lot of birds, man. And the bravery and the skill of every single man on all of these ships is something to be remembered for sure. It's incredible.
Absolutely.
It really is. It's incredible. So, Bill, do you got anything else you want to add?
No, this is a great story that needed to be told, Seth. Thank you for queuing this up for us.
It is indeed. Well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to Unauthorized History of Pacific War podcast wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it, and we do. If you want to see the video version of this, if you're not already looking at it, look at our YouTube channel called The Unauthorized History of the Pacific War Podcast, which, by the way, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but I have created a lot of different playlists on our channel. And because I've seen a lot of comments and I've read a lot of emails that you need to do an episode on this. Well, we probably already have. And I just decided that I'd make some little playlists on there so it'd be easier to find. So if you want to look for, I don't know, the Iwo Jima, there's a playlist for that. If you want to look for the liberation of the Philippines, there's a playlist for that. So yeah, Guadalcanal, good Lord. Yeah, there's a ton of those. So I mean, just go through the channel and find, it might be a little bit easier to find things. The seasons are still there, but the playlists are there now as well. So it might make it a little bit easier. And that it appears to be anyway. So anyway, back to the original closeout. I just want to say thank you again very much for listening and or watching. My name is Seth Perrodin. Hope to see you next week. Bill, bring us home.
And I'm Bill Tody, shorter than normal. See you again next week.